Good morning. I'd like to begin with a note to the folks that schedule the speakers for the services. Every time I'm scheduled to speak on Potluck Sunday, the church's chicken guy oversleeps and I can't get chicken. Maybe a little negative energy operating there. we may need to make some adjustments. My subject this morning is playing the game of life, and an alternate title might be New Thought Lessons from the Book of Job, a cautionary tale. You'll understand my dilemma when I get into the talk. But I'd like to begin by, let me see a show of hands. How many of you folks still read the comic strips every morning? Quite a few of you I see. I certainly do. I recommend it. It's a great way to start the day. My all-time favorite strip is the pickle strip about the elderly couple, Earl and Opal. I have even accused my wife of corresponding with the guy that draws that strip. Some of the stuff that shows up there hits a little too close to home to be entirely coincidental. But the strip I wanted to mention this morning is the oldest one on the page, dating all the way back to 1930, and that's Blondie. You may have seen this strip a couple of months ago. Dagwood is on the phone with his neighbor, Herb Woodley, trying to promote a game of golf. And Herb says, "I'm sorry, Dag, I can't play golf today. My clubs are missing." And Dagwood comes back with, "All right, where did Tootsie hide them this time?" And Herb replies, "I'll find out after I've mowed the lawn." I would suggest to you that Tootsie is a good game player. Gaming has become a big deal in our society today. The invention of smartphones and tablets has made a multitude of games available to everyone. Even moderate-sized cities have several GameStop locations. You can download an unlimited number of games from the internet. Young people seem especially adept at game playing. You can game with people 1,000 miles away. You can game with people you don't even know. In fact, some sociologists think that for some people, it's become an addiction, and that young people are losing their interpersonal communication skills because they're so wrapped up in game playing. If you don't believe me, walk into an airport waiting room and look to see what's going on. About 80% of the people there will be hunched over a smartphone or a tablet, and most of them playing a game to pass the time. No one is engaging in conversation anymore. With game playing so prevalent in our society today, why is it that most people still think of life as a battle and don't recognize that it's a game? I would suggest to you it's because they haven't come to a complete understanding of the rules. You wouldn't dream of sitting down to a high-stakes poker game without knowing the rules completely. Yet, there's no higher stakes than the game of life itself, and most of us are playing without a complete understanding of the rules. You have to know how the system works. I believe I shared with you once before the story of the guy who looked out at the back window and sees that his backyard tool shed is being burglarized. He calls 911 only to hear the dispatcher report that they don't have anyone to send. There are no resources available. So he hangs up the phone, he waits a few minutes, calls back and says, "Don't worry about a fast response on that tool shed call. I shot those guys." Within 3 minutes, 3 or 4 police cars come rolling into the guy's yard. They catch the thieves in the act, arrest them. And when they're safely tucked away in squad cars, the shift captain comes to the homeowner and says, "I thought you said you shot those guys." And the homeowner says, "I thought you said you didn't have any resources to send." That homeowner knew how the system worked. Dr. Cherry Carter Scott, PhD, has written a marvelous little book called If Life is a Game, These Are the Rules. And it lists 10 rules. It's available in our library, by the way. It covers all the biggies. 1, you will be given a body which you must come to terms with and take care of. 2, you will be presented with lessons. 3, there are no mistakes, only lessons. 4, lessons not learned the first time get presented again and again and again. 5, there is no end to the lessons. There are 5 other rules listed in that book. The one I want to talk to you about this morning is number 8. What you make of life is up to you. If you don't remember anything else from this talk, remember this. The basic ground rule for playing the game of life is understanding and appreciating the creative power of the subconscious mind. It faithfully attracts and reproduces what is placed in it. It doesn't judge good or bad. It doesn't deal in quantities. It is completely non-discriminating. The major difference between New Thought churches and Orthodox churches is that in New Thought, we accept and understand that we create the situations in our lives. In Orthodox churches, they try to fix what's out there. Some of you may have heard Edwina Gaines, a New Thought, a prosperity teacher that operates in New Thought circles, tell the story of her life. She was raised during the Depression. Her family was very, very poor. On rare occasions, they would scrape up enough money to go to the movie, but of course there wasn't any money for treats. In those days, there was one treat that you could get at the movie theater and seemingly nowhere else, and that was candy-coated almonds. I remember that so well. It was the most expensive treat on the counter, and it was only on rare occasions that I could afford to get a box. In Edwina's mind, that had become a symbol of wealth, something that she earnestly desired and could never seem to get. In later years, she was offered the opportunity to travel to Mexico with a female friend of hers that Edwina's ex-husband described as a show pony. As they were walking the streets of Mexico City, men kept coming up to Edwina's friend and presenting her with flowers. No one ever presented any to Edwina, and she was getting a little miffed about the situation. One evening they were sitting in a restaurant, and a man came over to the table and presented Edwina's friend with flowers. Edwina had had it. She pronounced with great feeling, "Lord, I need a sign that you love me." And according to Edwina, at that time a waiter came over and placed upon the table a dish of candy-coated almonds. It was only then that Edwina realized that she was carrying outdated standards in her creative subconscious. Our master teacher, Jesus, knew the rules and how to apply them. His ministry was spent trying to convey those rules to his audiences. The Sermon on the Mount, which is contained in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, is a virtual treasure trove of game-playing rules for life. He taught us that when you pray, pray believing that you've already received. He warned us against being overly concerned with what we're going to eat or what we're going to wear. Consider the lilies of the field, he said. They toil not, neither do they spin. Yet Solomon, in all his glory, was not arrayed as one of these. Jesus hinted at mysterious forces operating in our lives that we couldn't fully understand. One day he saw a rich Pharisee preparing to deliver alms to one of the local widows. In those days, the rich would hire a drummer and a crier to go before them as they were giving alms to one of the local widows. They didn't have a social security system in that day. And so this crier would go before and say, everybody come and see Pharisee Brown present alms to Widow Jones. Jesus said, don't be like that. When you give alms, keep it a secret. Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And your heavenly Father, from whom there are no secrets, will reward you openly. Some of you may have read the book Magnificent Obsession by Reverend Lloyd C. Douglas. It's about a neurosurgeon who does wonderful things for patients and requires secrecy. He won't accept repayment, but suggests that folks pay it forward if they're able. They made a movie of that book in 1935 and made it again in 1954. I believe Rock Hudson starred in the 54 version. While I can't recommend the movies, the book is truly inspiring. What you may not know, I certainly didn't, is that that book is based upon a real-life neurosurgeon, a Dr. Edward A. Kahn, who was a member of Reverend Douglas's congregation. Jesus tells us that when we're fasting for spiritual purposes, don't put ashes on your head or keep a sad face so that people would know you're fasting. But oil your hair and wash your face. Keep your fasting secret. Today's equivalent, I guess, would be don't meditate in public places. Jesus warned against hoarding. He told the story of a farmer who had such a bountiful harvest that his barns couldn't hold it all. Instead of saying, gee, what a wonderful opportunity to share with my neighbors who are in need, he said, I'm going to tear down these barns and build bigger barns. And Jesus tells us that his soul was required of him that very night. Not many farmers in our congregation today. Our barns tend to take the form of trust funds, real estate investment trusts, mutual funds, and other investments. I can tell you from personal experience that having the government take your bountiful harvest and share it with others, only after taking a healthy cut for themselves, does not produce the same spiritual benefit as doing it yourself and where you can see that the need is great. Those of you who watch television know that there's a new series on called Hoarders. It's about people who get so obsessed with getting stuff that they literally bury themselves in it. They buy clothes they never wear, books and magazines they never read, and they never throw anything away. Eventually, it gets to be a health hazard. My daughter works for one of the national companies that cleans up after disasters such as aircraft crashes and tornadoes and floods. They have a division that deals with folks like that. They actually have to wear hazmat suits and special breathing apparatus when they go into those places. And sometimes the structure itself has to be torn down. The culprit is fear. Fear that there won't be enough. Fear that God will abandon them and not provide. Where do we draw the line between being prudent and being fearful? Sometimes it gets a little fuzzy, doesn't it? Perhaps you heard about the woman that went into the newspaper office in Edinburgh, informed him that her husband had died and wanted to know how much it would cost to place an obituary notice. The obituary editor informed her that it would be 50 pence per word. So she thought for a moment and said, let it read, Angus MacFarlane died. The obituary editor, somewhat amused by the degree of thrift that she was exercising, informed her that there was a 7-word minimum on obituary notices. She thought for a moment and said, let it read, Angus MacFarlane died. Golf clubs for sale. Jesus told us that we're on our way to the temple to offer a sacrifice. And remember on the way that we have an issue with our brother, to leave your sacrifice before the altar and go and be resolved with your brother. Then return and offer your sacrifice. This advice touches on a major factor in playing the game of life, merging the spiritual with the practical. We all have these blocks, unresolved issues that keep us from receiving the good that God has in store for us. Resentments, guilt, and shame are effective barriers that keep us from receiving the good that we're entitled to as children of the Most High God. The classic case of what can happen to you if everything you believe about the nature of God is wrong and your mind is filled with fear is preserved to us in the Bible in the book of Job. Almost all Bible commentators regard the book of Job as a literary masterpiece of the wisdom movement, on a par with Milton's Paradise Lost. Perhaps it is, but it's also a dramatic account of the power of the subconscious mind. We don't know who wrote it. It appears to date from the period following the Jewish exile in Babylon, about the beginning of the 5th century BC. It may have used a model dating from 2000 BC, a Sumerian poem that it was only recently recovered. The Sumerian poem is about a very wealthy man that lost everything but didn't blame God. That doesn't quite fit Job, does it? Because Job certainly does blame God. The Jewish writer may have become familiar with that poem during the Babylonian exile. All of the characters are foreigners except Job. The book is apparently placed in the canon as an explanation of why bad things happen to good people. If so, it's a dramatic failure because the answers are entirely unsatisfactory. And I'm not the first one to notice, because the Bible scholars tell us that the book has been added to and edited to the point where sometimes it's difficult to tell who's doing the talking. It certainly falls short in explaining why bad things happen to good people. For those of us who've had the advantage of the teachings of Jesus, the writings of mystics such as Joel Goldsmith, Ernest Holmes, Emma Curtis Hopkins, A Course in Miracles, it can serve as a cautionary tale. Job is presented as a near-perfect man who fears God. I don't mean fear in the respect sense of the word. I mean Job was afraid of God. He was afraid of offending God. Job was rich. I mean the Donald Trump kind of rich. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 she-donkeys managed by many servants. He had children, 4 sons and 3 daughters, who were real party animals, as the children of wealthy so often are. Whenever they would party, Job would offer special sacrifices in the event that they had offended God. Job lived in fear that his wealth would be taken from him. And then, on what must go down in history as the worst day ever, Job's servants begin to report. The Sabaeans have swept down and taken the oxen and the she-donkeys, killed your servants, and I alone escaped to tell you. He had not finished speaking when another servant appeared and reported that fire had come down from heaven and consumed the sheep and the shepherds too. I alone escaped to tell you. That servant had hardly finished speaking when another servant reported that Chaldeans had swept down and made off with the camels and slaughtered the servants. I alone escaped to tell you. He had hardly finished speaking when another servant reported that a gale wind had come from the desert, collapsed the roof on the house where his children were partying, and all were killed. He alone escaped to tell Job. Although Job is devastated and bad news travels fast, although Job doesn't voice any lament against God at the time, he is clearly resentful and doesn't understand why God is letting this happen to him. As his resentment grows, he becomes infected with skin ulcers from his head to his toe. You've heard me quote my late mother-in-law before on that subject. It's not so much what you eat that makes you sick, it's what's eating you. And there's a great deal eating Job. Job's 3 friends come to comfort him and sit with him in silence for 7 days and nights. Finally, Job breaks his silence and begins to curse the day of his birth. From a long speech of self-pity, the most significant words are these: remember this. Whatever I fear comes true. Whatever I dread befalls me. For me there is no calm, no peace. My torments banish all rest. Even though his experience is an almost perfect outpicturing of his worst fears, Job still doesn't connect the dots. No one explained to Job that worry and anxiety are negative forms of prayer. No one ever told Job that what you defend against, you make real to your own mind. Job doesn't see himself responsible for what's happened to him. Job's friends assure him that God doesn't punish righteous people and that he must have done something to offend God. Job wants a hearing. He wants to justify himself before God. Here we are thousands of years later, and we still hear the lament. How could God let this happen to me? Jesus knew full well and tried to convey to his audiences that the power wasn't coming from some far-off place, but from within our very own minds. You might say that Jesus was conscious of his subconscious, the power that resided there, and he demonstrated it often. Your presence on this planet means that you signed up to play the game of life. You can play it much more successfully if you appreciate that your subconscious is creating all the time, whether you want it to or not. You can play it smart. God wants you to play it smart because God wants you to win. Thank you.